We're seeing experiments now with like congestion pricing in New York City,
Yeah.
for example, that our early stage analysis is suggesting they are very good for society from an
Yeah.
air quality perspective, from a safety perspective, from a bus and transit efficiency perspective, by removing cars and by pricing it accordingly, internalizing those externalities
Yeah.
that these vehicles have, we're able to improve the way a city runs in aggregate. So I do think, that type of thinking is appropriate here for AVs and for how we think about mobility in the future.
So, before we jump into today's episode, I want to share a quick word from our partners at Terawatt. We all know the future of ride hail and autonomy is electric. New fleets are entering markets and need a base of operations, places to charge up and get back on the road. But they can't afford downtime, and that's where Terawatt infrastructure comes in. They take something complex and expensive, fleet charging infrastructure, and delivers, letting fleets focus on their core business of serving rides. Terawatt is building high powered charging hubs strategically placed right where ride hail demand is its highest. So think about 30 plus fast chargers in a central business district. Now that's a lot of power. Their sites are also designed to optimize AV fleet performance with 98% charger uptime, infrastructure for data offload, and thoughtful layouts that get vehicles in and out fast, all for a monthly fee. You can check them out at terawattinfrastructure.com, and we'll also leave contact information for the company in the show notes. All right, on to the episode. Dr. Matthew Raifman is the research lead for policy and automated vehicles at UC Berkeley's SafeTREC Center, focusing on the safety and societal impacts of automated vehicles. He previously led public-private AV pilots at Ford Smart Mobility in Miami-Dade County and Washington, D.C., and holds degrees from Boston University, Harvard Kennedy School, and Tufts University. Dr. Raifman, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, you've got an impressive bio. So I think I really like, though, that you kind of have this mix of obviously, kind of the technical side in your work at Berkeley these days, but you also worked in private industry too.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I like to think of myself as the transboundary term gets on my nerves, but I do tend to think of myself as operating in different segments of the space.
All right. Well, I won't make you pick a favorite just yet, but I would love to know what do you normally work on over at UC Berkeley, and what does your day to day look like?
Yeah, so I'm part of a research team at a center at UC Berkeley, which is part of ITS, the Institute for Transportation Studies. Our center is called SafeTREC, and we primarily work on road safety. So a lot of our work is on behalf of the state and other interested parties, Office of
Hmm.
Traffic Safety, Caltrans, the Department of Motor Vehicles, different entities that are concerned with road safety. And I work on a bunch of different topics. I work on the changing vehicle fleet, so how vehicles are getting larger and heavier and what implications that may have for safety. A lot of the work is focused on autonomous vehicles,
Hmm.
understanding the data that's out there, what we can say about the safety of these vehicles and their operations, as thinking about novel topics like how can we rethink how we set speed limits in California and maybe inform our approach from other approaches around the world, like from New Zealand and Australia. So it runs the gamut,
Hmm.
but a lot of the work is focused on road safety.
Interesting. And so, I guess mechanically, how might this work in real life? Do these organizations hire you, or you guys do research on your own and then present it and provide it as sort of a, I guess, public good or service?
Yeah, exactly. So I should clarify, the things that I say today are my personal
Sure.
perspectives. They do not reflect the regents of the University of California or UC Berkeley. The legal affairs office would have my tail if I didn't say that.
We'll put a
But so
disclaimer in the show notes too for you. Don't worry.
a little disclaimer. But so our work is it's solicited. It tends to be on behalf of a project that the state is interested in. So one of the virtues of being a state institution at University of California is that we're in some senses part of the university, part of the state of California's system.
Hmm.
So it's easier for us to work directly with agencies than some private universities. So a lot of the work that we do is on behalf of a project that is of interest to the agencies, but then we also have separate funding that comes from funds made available for research from the gas tax and other sources like that, where we can come up with our own interesting ideas. So one of the projects that is an AV project, actually, they'll be spinning up is more focused on that space and is funded by that scheme. So it's something that we ideated ourselves. So it's a bit of a mix.
So autonomous vehicles are obviously hot right now. You're in the Bay Area, you're in Berkeley. I imagine maybe they're even hotter, even kind of more the talk of the town, versus, University of California, Los Angeles, for example, maybe. So talk a little bit about what got you interested in this Waymo CPUC data that you've written about recently on my site and on LinkedIn. And does it tie back into your work, or how it might tie back into some of your work?
Yeah. So I think, if we took a step back, even before my PhD and before my work at UC Berkeley, you mentioned in the introduction, but I worked at Ford.
Hmm.
And I worked at Ford Motor Company at an interesting period of Ford's AV exploration. It was back in the day when Ford had acquired a stake in Argo AI, and Argo was basically fulfilling Ford's autonomous vehicle technical work, their hardware and the vehicles on the road. And then Ford was coming up with the bigger business practice, the partnerships, the work with cities and states. So my role at Ford was to be the lead for partnerships on the East Coast. So I worked with a bunch of different cities that were interested in piloting AVs. And then I'd work with the cities and come back to Ford and be that liaison between the technical
Hmm.
teams, the legal teams, the business teams at Ford, and the interests of the city. And that was a very interesting experience because it opened my eyes up to all the different ways where there's alignment and where there's not alignment. And so I think the reason why I mention that is because the work, this just work you're mentioning around deadheading and around waiting time as an example, is very much informed by that work I did at Ford, where I understood that from a city's perspective, things
Hmm.
like deadheading that drives potentially congestion, curb management, how the public infrastructure is being used. Is there funding going back to the cities for use of that public infrastructure? How is the urban space designed? All equity concerns as well. Does a rising tide lift all boats when it comes to autonomous vehicles, or is only most affluent among us that get to utilize this technology? So all those big picture questions
Yeah.
that matter to a city that might not matter to a company, like,
Yeah.
you know, any company operating
Well,
because
I
they're
mean,
just
that was kind of the first thing that
dollars.
came to my head. I mean, I guess it's kind of, I don't know if this is obvious, but it's obvious to me that cities and autonomous vehicle companies do not have the same interests or goals. I don't know. What do you think?
I think that's right. I mean, I think there is alignment on some goals, right?
Yeah.
I mean, everyone, the city, the companies, the people, right? The residents all care about getting from point A to point B, and they want to do it as efficiently as possible, with the lowest cost as possible, and consistently, right? So not having variability in trip time and things like that. Those metrics, if you will, probably are the same for all interested parties. But then there's all these other questions, right? Around like we were talking about, like the curb is a really interesting one.
Yeah.
So, from the city's perspective, this is an asset. This is something that is owned by the city, maintained by the city. We have parking meters, right? So there's revenue coming in from those parking spots. But from an AV company, it might be very different, right? They want to have access to the curb when they do a drop off or a
Yeah.
pickup. They want it to be reliable. They don't probably want to pay,
Yeah.
right? So there's this conflict there that's inherent in the way that we operate. But that's not new.
Hmm.
There's nothing really unique about that. The same story was true for Uber and Lyft and for TNCs in the past. But I do think it's coming back again. We're getting this kind of like interesting rehash of a lot of the issues at the early stages of
Yeah.
Uber and Lyft. And we're at that phase again, I think, with autonomous vehicles.
Yeah, no, it's definitely interesting for me since I've been around for 11 years. So I
Yeah.
remember that kind of first Uber and Lyft, starting to work with cities and make their case. And I think a lot of those cases that they made have sort of pretty clearly proved to be false or, I call them like sound good on paper, but less so
Yeah.
in reality. And I see Waymo making a lot of similar arguments. So I think it's, kind of an important topic to address. And, that's helpful background with the cities and your experience, because that makes a lot more sense now about what you've been writing about lately. And I guess maybe too, we should define CPUC as the California Public Utilities Commission. They are the regulators for TNCs, so transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft, and also autonomous vehicle companies like Waymo. Does that sound right?
That sounds right.
Cool. And so, what got you interested in this Waymo CPUC data initially? And when did you kind of start taking a look at it?
Yeah. So I think, big picture question, I'm interested in what's going on with these new companies, with this technology in cities, and how's it affecting the way cities work.
Mhm.
It is nothing about Waymo particularly. It just
Yeah.
so happens that Waymo is the just dominant leader who is right now the only one
Yeah.
that is doing revenue generating rides, and therefore they're required. That's the thing with CPUC is, CPUC data is only required for deployments, which are essentially public revenue driven rides. So testing rides, companies testing AVs are not required to report CPUC data unless they're generating revenue from
Interesting.
trips. So right now, as of today, Waymo is the only one doing that. So
Yeah.
Waymo is the only one reporting, but it's nothing about Waymo in particular. So little data is reported on autonomous vehicles.
Mhm.
There's very little data out there. There's data on aggregate miles traveled under testing, and there's data that's voluntarily reported by certain companies around the miles traveled during operations. But we can see from the public perspective very little data. And so one of the very few pieces of data that's available is a form that's part of a heavily redacted broader report that the CPUC puts out every quarter. And in that form, in that data, you can see the total miles traveled by each company that's operating in the state of
Mhm.
California, each AV company. You can also see the distribution of those vehicle miles traveled across 3 different periods. And it's probably good to define those. And I'll do my best, but I know you're really knowledgeable about it too. So you should correct me if I get it wrong. But essentially, those 3 periods are broken down into period 1 is the period where the vehicles are driving around, they're moving if they're accruing vehicle miles traveled, but they don't have a trip assignment. They're just operating in the city environment without any public objective as far as trips go. Then period
And I guess
2
they could be driving
is,
around or parked during period 1.
yes, they could be parked. Exactly. That's an important point. And then period 2 is the period where the vehicles have been assigned a trip and they are now moving from wherever they were to where they need to pick up their next passenger. And then period 3 is the period that we would all normally think of, which is the time when the vehicle or the vehicle miles traveled, where the vehicle has a passenger in the back or in the passenger seat. So those 3 periods are actually collected and reported separately in terms of vehicle miles traveled through the CPUC data. So that availability of that data really piqued my interest because
Yeah.
it tells us that we can now analyze the period that the vehicle miles traveled that the vehicles have a passenger, and then all the time where they don't have a passenger and they're
Right.
entirely empty. And that is really important from a city level perspective.
Right. And I mean, I think if you start at period 3 from the operator perspective, I always like to call out this is really the money making period, right? You
Yes.
can't really charge people to drive to them, to wait for them. I mean, you can, but it's very low compared to, we always tell Uber drivers, like, you want to be going, it's really 65 miles an hour on the freeway and your wheels moving, right? You want to be moving with a passenger in the car because that's when you can charge the most. So that's kind of that incentive on the company, on the operator's side. So, maybe you could highlight a few of the trends that you first observed and, kind of generally what's the time period here we're looking at?
Yeah, and just to kind of pull this back to a point you made before, I'd say this is a metric where there is alignment
Mhm.
across the city and the AV operators. Both the cities or the public interest and the AV companies want to minimize deadheading time, right?
Yes.
Because it's not generating revenue, but it's also sort of wasted vehicle miles traveled on roadways and driving congestion
And
potentially.
deadheading would be period 1 and 2, right?
Exactly. Deadheading is a term I think probably deriving from buses and shipping industry
Mhm.
and the idea that this is a period where a vehicle is not loaded with cargo
Yeah.
and it's deadheading back to or planes, right? Same thing comes in transportation.
Yeah. And I don't know if we need to get into this today, but one area that I'd push back is period 3. I mean, cities don't necessarily want or have to have AVs. You know what I mean? Like
Yes.
in their
Yeah.
cities, right? There's an argument when you were mentioning
Mm-hmm.
the efficiency and the lowest cost, and consistently, I immediately thought of public transit and subway, right? So if
Yes.
we sort of remove that argument, maybe we'll come back to it, but we remove that argument for now and sort of assume, okay, AVs are here, they're operating in cities. Now that they're here, how do we want them operating? I think then cities and
Yes.
operators can both agree, yeah, we want someone in the car as much as possible. Otherwise, you're kind of driving around, clogging up the streets or taking up parking and not doing anything, right?
No, that's exactly right. My son takes the term zombie vehicles. That's what he calls them now. And that's a colloquial term. But Probably learned it from his dad. But anyway, I mean, yes, exactly. An empty vehicle driving around on the streets, we can all agree is in no one's interest, right?
Yeah.
So some of the interesting trends, so when you analyze this, you look at the period 1 and period 2 over time. I only looked at really January 2024 until the most recent data point, which as of when I did this analysis, that was September 2025. So it's almost 2 years. And the reason why is because that's the period where Waymo's been operating in California, doing trips and revenue generating trips reliably and reporting those. During that period, we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of trips per month that Waymo's been doing, up to most recently in the most recent quarter, over 1 million trips in a month, which is a spectacular increase from something around like 80,000 at the beginning of the period that we're looking at. So massive ramp up in the number of trips that are happening. What we've seen though is that in spite of, or at the same time, correlating with that increase in trips, deadheading's actually come down a little bit. So it's come down from around 52% in January 2024 to 44% of vehicle miles traveled in September 2025. So that 40%, that 44%, based on what I could glean from the literature and other studies that have been done around TNCs, so human-driven vehicles like Uber and Lyft, that 40 to 50 range is pretty consistent with the level of deadheading that's occurring amongst human-driven transportation network companies. So Waymo has brought their statistic in line with TNCs. Now, I don't personally think that's the ultimate goal. I think Waymo should be able to do better, right, than human-driven TNCs. Because one of the things that at least I thought about when kind of analyzing this and thinking about the implications of it, for a human-driven TNC, like a Lyft or an Uber, you as the company need to convince somehow your driver, and this is something you can, tell me about, but you need to convince your driver to move to where you need them to be, right? That is some aspect of the negotiation that occurs. It can be incentivized through financial means. There are other mechanisms for doing that. But you're dealing with this relationship that you have with the driver and trying to move them around your board of operations to get them where you need them to be for the next trip. Waymo doesn't have that problem. They don't have a negotiation. They do have the issue of moving their vehicles around, deadheading them to maneuver them into the best position for the next trip so they can minimize the waiting time for the customer. But they can do that at their own discretion. So that to me pulls down a little bit the barriers, the inertia, the kind of friction in the system compared to like a human-driven TNC.
Yeah, that's an interesting distinction. I mean, so Uber and Lyft have used various forms of what you mentioned, incentives. So they will physically pay you to go to certain areas. I mean, the surge map, we've got all these videos that tell drivers, don't chase the surge, right? But it's mentally, you see, I make more money in this area. It draws you towards that area. And then there's also heat maps that all of the companies use, which aren't necessarily guaranteeing money. And this is one thing that we've always criticized the companies. It's like, they're not really putting their money where their mouth is, right? They're sort of saying like, hey, go to this area and we promise it'll be busy. Will it be, or are they expecting demand, right? And so, and then you also just have behavior from human drivers that is not necessarily the most economically beneficial to them. And the reason for that may be that maybe they want to drive in certain areas. Maybe they want to drive in certain parts of town, right? There's been a lot of talk lately about, basically the companies, right? They've become very profitable by charging passengers as much as possible and paying drivers as little as possible, which I don't think is actually that outrageous. I mean, that's what most companies do. And from that, so Uber and Lyft have a feature called Trip Radar, for example, where they, instead of giving you a trip, they surface 10 trips and you can pick the ones that you want. And what that allows them to do, it kind of is like a reverse bidding, right? It's like, who's the lowest bidder? Who's willing to do this trip for the least amount? And it's not necessarily nefarious, but it's like, hey, I'm a driver. Oh, I want to go to that side of town, or, oh, I like that area, or I want that trip, or, whatever it might be. And so that, now I might drive 10 minutes to go pick up this passenger, and now Uber, and, they don't really have to pay me for that time. So I think there's actually, I'm on board with you. I think AVs should be, I don't know what the percent better they should be on deadheading, but I think they should be significantly better.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, those insights. Ones that, those of us on the outside wouldn't necessarily have, right? Who haven't driven or been privy to those conversations and visualizations. But yeah, I mean, I think that's nice to confirm it, because I do think we should, this is a statement I'll make across the board, right? We should expect better than human. And I think it's, even that is maybe too low a bar when it comes to AVs. It's the same thing with safety. It's like, is the discussion that we want Waymo, we want AV companies to just be better than killing 40,000 Americans every single year, right? Is
Yeah.
that really the like the utopia that we're designing with these new innovations that we're investing all this money into and design?
Yeah.
I mean, to me, that's like, maybe we can do a little bit better than that. And so
Yeah.
the same thing's true here. It's like, yeah, in a perfect world, I think we ought to get as close, it's as close to zero deadheading as possible for an efficient system to work, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's reasonable to get that below 30. I don't know what the numbers are here, but we should be able to get below 40, I would think, with this system.
Right. So, I mean, I think on the positive side, like you noted from January 2024 to September
Yep.
2025, and also kind of, we're talking about deadheading VMT. So that's vehicle miles traveled, because I think we might talk about time later on in the conversation,
Mhm.
which, this is a little analytical, but just to be clear. And the vehicle miles traveled are coming down over time. That's a positive thing. We expect that to continue to get better. I like what you said, that we should hold them to a higher standard. I think the other thing that I noticed when you posted your chart was that the P1 share of vehicle miles traveled was much higher than P2, right? It looks like, let's call September 2025, it was about 30%. So that means that the P2 time was 14%, right? Did that surprise you, or maybe you could expand on that a bit?
Yeah, yeah. So that's an interesting observation, right? So what we're saying is that the time, it's easy to say time, the miles traveled that these vehicles are doing without an assignment is surprisingly high compared to the amount of miles traveled going from wherever they are to their next assignment.
Yeah.
I was surprised, but also not surprised that it is surprising. So let me unpack that. You know, there's a lot to this business and there's a lot to the data that we don't know from the outside. It's just a number reported in a spreadsheet. It could be that Waymo is doing testing, but not officially testing, right? So they're basically driving the roads, they're collecting data on the roadway, they're
Yeah.
improving their maps, they're collecting information about routing and efficiency and where pickup drop-off spots could be and all this sorts of stuff, right? That could all be collected during those miles. They're not useless miles traveled,
Yeah.
probably, for the company. So I don't know why that proportion's higher, but it could be that that's the case.
And I think just to like clarify that actually could happen in real life pretty easily, that, basically the Waymo is driving around during period one. Like normally they might park, but they're like, yeah, we might as well drive around and collect a bunch of data, or, oh, we need to, 25 cars need to collect a bunch of data. And that would be captured in something like that.
Yes. Now, what's a little tricky is, and this is very, very in the weeds, these vehicles are most likely operating under a testing permit and a deployment permit.
Hmm.
It is possible to switch between one and the other for the company. Now, because of that, it is possible to switch to a testing operation run,
Right.
even with the same vehicle that just did a deployment run. But I think typically those testing runs are used for like new software, an updated map, a new vehicle type, right?
Yeah.
So those types of things are not necessarily what we're talking about here. But it is possible that
And
type
also,
of relationship's happening.
I like that you analyze this over such a long 2-year period, because I mean, Waymo is getting to the point, right? I was 3,000 vehicles across their fleet, doing 450,000 trips a week. I mean, over time and fleet size, you can't really mess around as much, right? You kind of need to
Right.
start, you kind of need to make money, right? You can't lose too much money, basically. So you would expect the behavior of the fleet to normalize over time and kind of reflect the true operating reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing that we're not necessarily talking about is demand, right?
Hmm.
And, The deadheading piece of this is also affected by demand, right?
Yeah.
If everyone is requesting a ride and there's actually a really large user base, it's easier to move a vehicle from its last drop off to its next pickup without a
Right.
lot of deadheading miles. So all these things are shifting, right? Supply is changing over this period. Trips are changing, reflected in demand.
Yeah.
Then the operating environments are changing. We've moved from, the Bay Area to a much broader segment of
Right.
California, including LA, down by you and south of the city. And even now in the future, they're actually authorized to do testing now in Berkeley and East Bay. So they're going to be expanding possibly as far out to like Tahoe and further north. So there's a lot of changing happening during this
Got it.
period.
So the other theory that I think you and I discussed about this P1 being so much greater than P2, I kind of initially when I first discovered your work, I think I left a comment on your LinkedIn post that I think was kind of turned out to be wrong, but I basically said that, when I take Waymo, right, like during busy times, it's all, I can't get a ride, which tells me that P1 would be close to zero, right? During very busy times, P1, they're always with a trip, right? So they always have a request, right? When it's really busy. But the issue that you have with Waymo is once you get that request, especially in LA, 10, 15, 20-minute ETAs during busy times, right? So now I'm waiting, and I guess if the car isn't necessarily driving to me, this is where it gets really confusing, right? If you're dropping off Matt and that's 10 minutes of the 20-minute ETA, that actually wouldn't necessarily count in the CPUC data. It would only count
Right.
from when they drop off Matt and now they're driving to me. And so it might only be, it might be a 20-minute wait for me, but it's 10 minutes to drop Matt off at the end of his trip and then another 10 minutes for it to drive to me. And you're right, like in LA, which is much more spread out, I imagine that P2 has to, would definitely be higher than San Francisco, or it's likely higher than San Francisco, where, even though there's traffic, it's very short distances. The city's only 7 by 7 miles, right? So,
Yeah.
I imagine that might be a little smaller. So that was kind of my initial reaction, but I think that was a little bit wrong, right? Because you pointed out that you also have to include off peak.
No, that's right. And the other thing is they're gonna at some point in the algorithm make a choice whether or not to allocate, even if a vehicle is free, it might be too far away.
Yeah.
So they might opt out of allocating that to your ride. And therefore that vehicle that was potentially an option for you becomes a P1, aimlessly driving around
Yeah.
vehicle, as opposed to one that's been immediately routed to the next available trip. So it gets
Yeah.
complicated really quickly. But I do think it's worth saying just because it's complicated doesn't mean the high level statistics don't matter.
Right.
Because actually, if we do take these steps back and we think about what matters for a city, the deadheading matters. It doesn't really matter why.
Yeah.
It matters that the vehicles are adding
Yeah.
additional vehicle miles traveled on the road, that otherwise wouldn't have been driven and might be contributing to congestion. The other thing to note that's interesting, it comes from some of my work that I've done during the PhD, which actually focused on air quality and emissions in transportation. It's important to note that like just because these vehicles are electric vehicles
Mm.
does not mean that their net impact on pollution is zero.
Right.
Because if a vehicle contributes to congestion and slows traffic down, and those other vehicles on the roadway are not electric vehicles, those tailpipe emissions are going to be, increased in that area because of
Yeah.
the slower traffic speed and congestion. And also the charging that happens for these vehicles. When they're charging a vehicle, they're using up energy. That energy is created somewhere. And if it's
Mhm.
not renewable energy, you are in a sense offshoring that pollution to some other neighborhood where the power plant is. So there are implications to
Tires too, right?
excessive miles traveled. There's also brake and tire wear,
Yeah.
which are not insignificant either. So there are issues with this from an air pollution or environmental perspective too.
So I think that's a good point. I don't know if you pointed this out in in some of your writings, but I mean, okay, so they're doing 1 million trips a month, and 44% of the time they're
Yeah.
of the miles traveled are without a passenger. So I don't know how many miles per trip they're doing, but if it's a few miles per trip, we're talking.
Yep.
I mean, basically over 1 million miles, right, every single month in California that basically has no passenger, right, and is kind of deadheading miles.
Exactly. And that was actually, to my knowledge, the original intent behind
Hmm.
including this breakdown of P1, 2, and 3. It was actually an environmental air quality perspective. I think this originated with TNCs. It's not a Waymo thing. But that was the original idea here, was that this was a potential contributor to air quality pollution.
Got it. So before we move on to your second post about waiting time, anything else to wrap up here?
Well, I think we're good to move on. I mean, I think the big picture of the deadheading piece is that I think they're performing similarly now to TNCs, which is what we'd expect, like Uber and Lyft. The trajectory is downward, which is a positive thing for society, but it's still quite high and reflects some of the negative externalities of this mobility option.
Yeah. So in your second post that we published over on the Driverless Digest, you looked at, all right, let me read the title here, How Waymo Spends Its Time Between Trips. I think that was a good title. I can't remember. I think you might have come up with that one, but it, kind of dug into, or why don't you explain what you dug into with the second piece of your analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. So we just talked about vehicle miles traveled, which is movement. But I don't know, any of us that are living in a place where autonomous vehicles are operating, I see them more often than not. Well, I wouldn't say more often than not, but I see them quite often parked on the side of the road. They might be parked in a bike lane or a bus lane after a drop off very temporarily. They might be double parked. They might be parked in a parking spot specifically. So it dawned on me that when we look at just vehicle miles traveled, we are only tracking movement. And we're missing a big part of this discussion from a city perspective, from a societal perspective. How much time are these vehicles spending in situ, right? Like parked at some location? And do those individual moments of pickup drop-offs aggregate to be a fairly substantial number of hours? So that was the idea behind this, was to take another column in that very special month table that is produced in the CPUC.
CPU website's going to get crashed due to all the traffic.
I know, it's either going to get crashed or it's going to get redacted. But it's the waiting time metric. So the waiting time metric, we actually, you and I had to do a little bit of digging here to try to get at, what specifically is the definition here. And I believe the definition is it's P1 and is that right? It's P1 or is it P1 and P2? I'm going to need to actually look it up.
Waiting time is a time when an AV is unassigned and either parked or driving around.
P1. So P1. So it has to be P1 only.
Yeah.
So that was the idea, was to look at, okay, we know the vehicle miles traveled, right, for P1 from the separate data set. And now we know the time spent in P1 that could be moving or could be parked.
Right.
So if we assume the speed at which those vehicles are traveling, we can actually get to how much time is spent parked.
Yeah.
This was the novelty of the work. So the big interesting insights at the beginning of this work were that even more so than VMT, waiting time per trip is decreasing dramatically.
Right.
So Waymo has halved its waiting time per trip from January 2024 until September 2025. Really dramatic change, from 40 minutes a trip to under 20 minutes a trip.
Right.
And that, to me, is a big takeaway here about the improved efficiency, the routing, the matching that's happening between riders and the supply of vehicles. Increases in vehicle numbers probably also are helping this too. But even as Waymo's expanded dramatically across California, it's been able to manage down this waiting time per trip. So I think that's actually super impressive.
I mean, I think when you first shared this, I thought, wow, 40 minutes per trip just at a high level, that seems like a lot of time for waiting, right?
It's a lot of waiting. Yep.
Yeah.
And it's not, and we should point out that it's not necessarily what you as the customer would see. It's a separate metric about how the vehicle is spending its time.
Right.
Right.
And so the vehicle is waiting 40 minutes to basically before they receive a trip request.
Yep. Before they're matched.
Yeah.
You know?
Before they're matched, actually. Right. And then they have to drive to the customer and then fulfill the trip.
Exactly. Yep, that's exactly right. And it ends up being, we use a rough estimate here of like about 1,000. Remember, this is a period that goes back a year and a half. So a period where Waymo had actually fewer than 1,000 vehicles in state of California. These numbers are challenging to nail down exactly, but if we just guesstimate and see 1,000 vehicles operating in the state of California on average during this period, we're talking about something on the order of 10 days, 12 days worth of waiting per month. So it's a lot of time spent without an assignment to a trip. or picked up or with a passenger in your vehicle.
Right. And so I think that begged the question, okay, so what are they doing while they're waiting, right?
Right. Yeah. And that's where I started actually with
Hmm.
this, because I had witnessed a Waymo in a very popular, well-trafficked area
Hmm.
near the Embarcadero in San Francisco. And I watched it park at a red curb and I watched it sit there for a couple minutes. Now, I am not in the practice or in the business here of gotcha, right? Like I understand from a personal perspective, having worked on these issues. I also totally understand the challenges around navigating this, the behavior
Right.
insights that are drawn from human drivers and behaving in what is now still dominated by a human network of operations. So I get it. So it's not the point to say gotcha to Waymo, but the point I'm trying to make is I'm seeing on the ground, right? Like these vehicles stopping in places they shouldn't stop and
Hmm.
spend 5 minutes there, 5 minutes here. So could we quantify that to some extent? And so that was the effort here, was to look at trying to get it an estimate. It's an estimate. It's not precise, but are they spending that time parked or moving when they're not assigned to a trip? And, my analysis would suggest that they are spending a pretty substantial amount of time parked. And that is problematic. I actually think that's something that we should talk about. Like, is it better to drive around when you don't have a trip, or is it
Yeah.
better to expect them to be parked? It will absolutely change based on the condition. So what is better for society will change based on the conditions of the operating environment. So if we conceptualize at one extreme an empty block with
Mm.
no cars parked on the road. I
Yeah.
mean, this doesn't exist in California, but
Mhm.
in any city in California. But say there's a block and there's no cars parked on the road. It's legal to park in one of those parking spots. Okay, it's probably better that the Waymo be parked, right, in one of those empty parking spots
Right.
than driving around adding miles. At the other extreme, imagine a busy business district. It's hard to navigate it. It's dangerous to bikers and walkers and pedestrians and vulnerable road users because it's a dense urban environment with a lot of traffic. We don't necessarily want the Waymo sitting or driving in that environment because it's yet another vehicle that complicates an already complicated situation. So it's absolutely situation driven, what's best for society. But we need to ask the questions about
Yeah.
what these vehicles are doing. And I would even take a step further and say it's worth asking what we're doing from a regulatory perspective and a policy perspective in the state of California and elsewhere around what we expect and what our goals are for
Yeah.
how these vehicles would operate in our environment when they're not on a trip. And I'm not sure we're at the point here yet where we are as a society answering that question and signaling to the companies what we expect them to do.
Yeah, I think we're still figuring it out. But boy, Matt, you really opened up a can of worms here because it got me thinking about, a lot of, first of all, AVs, they behave differently than humans. So, I mean, like how our cities are designed, right? Like everybody, humans aren't just going to like drive around the block all day. Like, why would you do that as a human? But AVs might, right? Because there's no cost
Right.
to doing that. So that's one. And then, kind of similar, that would apply to parking too, right? Like they might also sit in a parking spot. Oh, meter maid comes, they're gonna leave, right? A human wouldn't really just sit there for no reason, right? Unless they have some kind of purpose. And so, the cities kind of aren't really designed for that. And then,
Mhm.
sort of like you said, we kind of have to figure out what is that best behavior. It reminds me, I just interviewed the CEO of Coco Delivery Robotics, and when I first started talking to them, they told me that the goal was to operate these sidewalk delivery robots on sidewalks that were less traveled. Right. So I kind of
Mhm.
liked that concept. Like, yeah, you probably don't want it on the really busy walkway, but like I'm okay with Waymo parking a block away or 2 blocks away where people aren't fighting for spots. Now, I don't know how the heck they would know that or who would regulate that or what goes into that, but there's definitely some principles that I don't know if anything jumps to your mind, but I think there's definitely some principles that, I think would suit itself to benefit both cities and Waymo.
Yeah, no, these are the questions we should be asking, right?
Yeah.
One thing that I thought was interesting is if we try to learn a little bit from the pickup drop off early stage of transportation network companies and
Hmm.
how cities were trying to develop a world where they collaborated with Uber and Lyft to provide a good service, but also do it within the constraints of an urban environment. one of the things that happened was there was piloting of pickup drop-off zones, right? The idea that there were certain designated locations where you could pick up a person or not. That's an interesting concept. I think the problem with that is it's not scalable to the level where we need it to be for where the market is now. I mean, where people are getting picked up and dropped off on every street across these cities where AVs are operating. It's not feasible realistically to go back to a world where there's limited service and you have to go to a certain location. And, we experimented with that, right? Like with Uber and Lyft, there was remember, what was it, like Pool or something, where you would go to a point and get picked up there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't think that model will necessarily work, but I do think there probably needs to be an endpoint here where behind the scenes, there's a negotiation. By that, I mean a computer negotiation, right? Like something behind the scenes that's totally automated, where the AV is negotiating with some map of available locations across the city, and it's reserving or reserving a small segment of a pickup drop off at that location. And that whole interface has to happen behind the scenes so that, a city can manage its curb, but do it in a way that works for the companies that are needing those services, which are digital companies now that are automated services, right? They're not a Uber or Lyft driver anymore.
Yeah. So I don't know if we'll be able to fully answer the question right now, but you did pose this lingering question, right? Is it better for AVs to be parked or driving around when they don't have a trip assignment? And it sounds like in certain cases it's better to be parked, and in certain cases it's better to be driving around, but both should really be as low as possible. Does that sound like a good answer? What do you think?
Yeah, I like that. I think that's good. I mean, I think we're trying to minimize use of public infrastructure that has no purpose for society. So driving around without a passenger is counterproductive for society. And so is parking in a spot without any purpose, but to store the vehicle. That's also counterproductive for society. So we just want to minimize those.
Yeah.
Probably at the societal level, regardless of if it's a human or an AV. That's the other thing, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not actually an AV problem. It's just brought up because of the presence of AVs pushing these questions. But we also don't really want, as a society, people parking their cars in cities and leaving their cars on the wasting space 95% of the time, taking up that space that could be used for a parklet or a bike lane or, some other purpose.
I'm glad you brought that up because Uber and Lyft have been a pretty big, easy scapegoat, I think, for a lot of the ills of society. There's a lot of analysis, right, that shows that, Uber and Lyft are, often less than 5 or 10% of total vehicle miles traveled in most major cities. So they've added a lot of, 2/3 of the recent congestion is from Uber and Lyft, but that's because they're recent, right? But on an absolute basis, they're actually very low. And so it's really only policies, like congestion pricing that kind of apply to everyone that tackle. So I'm kind of glad you brought that up because AVs are definitely surfacing a lot of these issues, but I do think it's important that the solutions we come up with kind of like address AVs, they address Uber and Lyft human drivers, and then they also address if there was some situation where, people were just driving around all crazy and we banned AVs from doing that, but then everyone was still driving around aimlessly, that wouldn't solve the solution at all, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely agree. I think that's really important. And we're seeing experiments now with congestion pricing in New York City, for example, that our early stage analysis is suggesting they are very good for society from an air quality perspective, from a safety perspective, from a bus and transit efficiency perspective, by removing cars and by pricing it accordingly, internalizing those externalities that these vehicles have, we're able to improve the way a city runs in aggregate. So I do think, that type of thinking is appropriate here for AVs and for how we think about mobility in the future.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing that we didn't talk on, and this may not be about, particularly as interesting for your work and for this audience, but it's important to recognize that autonomous vehicles is not going to be a limited thing just for ride hail. That's something I think is an important point to make. The same technology that is disrupting Uber and Lyft and taxis and changing the way that ride hail works is going to make its way into personal vehicles.
Yeah, that's
so we're going to have the same. It's almost like It's starting at the same point, it's going through two different trajectories, and it's going to come back to the same
Yeah.
impact on society. So we have to plan for that too, that we're going to see individually owned vehicles that have the
Yeah.
same type of technology
Well,
happening as well.
Tensor just made a big announcement at CES. I think they even said they're going to have a personally owned robotaxi on the road by the end of 2026, or that's their goal. And I think you're right. If I owned one of those, I'd probably tell it to drop me off downtown and then circle around the block and don't pay $50 for parking until I'm done with dinner, because the cost is going to be much less,
Right.
or go find a free parking spot while I'm at dinner. So you're right. I guess this autonomous future will apply to multiple different modes. And the kind of the thing I wanted to end on was maybe ask you, I guess maybe what data you want to see from the CPUC, or what don't we know from this data, and what are you going to be looking at going forward?
Yeah. So we don't know a lot. But I think one of the things that I have always found interesting, even outside of autonomous vehicles, is what we call in the space exposure. So this would be the vehicle miles travels piece,
Mm,
understanding how the vehicles are moving, not at an aggregate level across the whole state, but like when those miles are traveled, what time of day, what
mm,
location, what
yeah,
geography. Is it in an urban environment? Is in this neighborhood of San Francisco or that? Is it in Los Angeles or Tahoe? Right? Like, where are these miles traveled? Because for so many of the things that we care about, like, for example, fatalities and serious injuries, we need to adjust those to account for differential activity patterns. If you just take a really busy intersection compared to one that has very little traffic, if the busy intersection has the same fatalities per intersection as the not busy one,
yeah,
then the risk is very different, right? Because the denominator of the number of vehicles going through that intersection is much higher in one case versus the other. And
yeah.
the same thing's true for autonomous vehicles. We don't know where they're traveling and what magnitude anymore. We don't know if they're in certain neighborhoods more often than others. And therefore, if there are more incidents in that neighborhood than another, we can adjust those by the increased miles traveled or the increased activity in that neighborhood. So that's a really important part of this that I think is missing.
So I guess I'm learning something right now. That term would be called exposure, kind of knowing when and where the miles are being traveled.
Yeah, it actually comes from like the public health space, but the idea, yeah, is just understanding that denominator
Yeah.
and adjusting for activity patterns.
Right. Well, and I think that's actually really interesting, because this is one thing that I've always brought up. I've done hundreds of interviews, and a lot of times I'll interview passengers, people. I remember I did an interview with a couple blind passengers actually in 10 years. I've interviewed two or three of them, and, elderly people who talk to me about, oh, I take Uber and Lyft, now, or I take AVs now. And, I go to doctor's appointments. And I think there is some data and science around, obviously if you have more transportation options at your fingertip, you go to more doctor appointments and it helps. So I do think not all trips are created equal. That might be
Mhm.
a very small percent of trips, but like for those types of trips, I'm all for Friday, Saturday night, what Uber drivers affectionately call the party hours. Those are different trips, right? And honestly, they may be good, they may be bad to a city, but if a city is very economically focused, we really want to revitalize our business district, I actually would say they're pretty good to have,
Yeah.
that option at your fingertips. So I do think, yeah, knowing basically not all trips are created equal, and really knowing when and where, and kind of why, or deducing why some of these trips are happening. I think I could make the argument that some trips, I'm okay with a driver sitting around empty for hours on end if they take someone to a very important doctor's appointment, for example, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the ways that Uber and Lyft were used in their early stages and are still used is for those types of trips. They're called paratransit trips for a lot
Yeah.
of for transit agencies. So required by law to provide the same level of service for
Hmm.
people who are immobile or unable to use the transit system.
Yeah.
And so historically, those types of trips were fulfilled by a very expensive contracted operator that ran something
Hmm.
akin to a small bus that might have one passenger in it.
Yeah.
And if we and as cities have done, move those types of trips to more efficient ways, it saves money for the city and it provides a better experience for the customer, for the
Yeah.
traveler. So I think that same concept is really important here. It's also part of the equity of this whole thing, which is everyone able to access this technology and these innovations if they are improving the quality of life for folks? They do put pressure on public transit, as you mentioned at the top. So given that pressure that's happening, fewer riders on transit, the implications there, it's really important that these technologies be available to everyone. So I
Yeah.
don't know how that's going to play out, and I don't know how it's going to be regulated or incentivized to provide, access to these new amazing technologies for everyone who lives in the city.
Yeah.
That's a really important question too.
Well said. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. We covered a lot today, and I'll go ahead and leave a link to a couple of the LinkedIn posts you did. I did a post on this on the Driverless Digest. You did a post on this on the Driverless Digest. So that's 4 links. And then also, if folks want to find you or learn more about your research or your work at UC Berkeley, what's the best place for them to go?
Check out SafeTREC, SAFE, like safe, and then TREC at Berkeley.
All right, great. We'll leave a link in the show notes. Dr. Raifman, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.